It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to talk about promoters. We're going to talk about Dana White. We're going to talk about Don Davis. We're going to talk about Francis Ngannou and Jon Jones and Tom Aspinall. We're also going to take a quick look at what's going on with boxing as well. And if we have time, we're going to get to a little bit of something else at the very end. We will see if time allows for it. But for right now, those are our topics. If you want access to all of the content, remember, you've got to subscribe because about half of the show will end up behind a paywall because, we got to make sure that we keep ourselves afloat here. Now, John, how the heck are you?
Good. Staying out of trouble. I'm staying in Hollywood, away from downtown, and I guess the Paramount Compton area. People follow the news. We have some turmoil here in Los Angeles, but it's limited in certain areas. So I'm staying out of that. But the air quality is terrible. So I apologize if I have a cough or my voice sounds out of it today.
Well, we will get right down to business then. First question, have there been any new updates to the antitrust cases that you're aware of? Anything filed with Pacer or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's technically not new, but we have the minutes of proceedings for the judge from the hearing. So it gives us a better summary of what he ordered coming out of that hearing last Tuesday that I wasn't at present, and I could not follow everything the judge said, as you know, so I was taking notes, so I might have missed a few things, but this gives us a good summary of what he ordered, and he granted, I'll go through it really quick on the motion, he hereby ordered that the motion to compel, now that is what the plaintiffs were asking. They were asking that certain things in discovery that the judge compelled them to be released to them from the defendants. He motion to compel was granted in part and denied in part. The parts that he granted, there's just a long list. Really, the plaintiffs came off good because the judge ordered a lot of stuff, ordered to be handed over in the request for production. The stuff he denied were basically things like discussions of loans and debts, financial discussions between third parties outside the UFC. So stuff like the negotiations between sponsors, they have to hand that over. Stuff about pay-per-view, fighter pay, all those things they have to hand over. But when you get into other discussions of like the TKO stock and things like that, that does not have to be handed over. So there's just a long list of stuff, but the plaintiffs ended up getting the vast majority of what they're asking for. It was further ordered that the defendant Endeavor has until July 3rd, 2025, to provide the plaintiff a listing of information related to business and personal phones, phone numbers, and apps or programs being used on these devices during the relevant time period as described on the record. It is further ordered that the motion to seal is deferred. That is what the defendants were asking. They had asked for a motion to seal a certain Endeavor content and other UFC content. They wanted to not have that revealed. The judge is delaying that until the discovery process starts. It is further ordered that the motion to deny class certification is deferred. Plaintiffs shall file a response to the motion by June 10th, 2025, and defendants may file a reply by June 17th, 2025. This is if people remember, the defendants had filed a motion to deny class certification based on the fact that the Johnson class did not represent all the fighters, for just a bunch of reasons. And he's delaying it slightly to give the plaintiffs a chance to reply basically on what they're going to do with the Cirkunov case. Cirkunov is Mikhail Cirkunov. Misha Cirkunov v. Zuffa was a separate complaint filed. People probably remember from 2 weeks back, where he was going to represent all those with arbitration agreements. So he's delaying that, but it is further ordered that discovery between Johnson et al. Zuffa, Cirkunov v. Zuffa, and Davis v. Zuffa shall be consolidated to the extent that such discovery overlaps. I would take that as a victory for the plaintiffs because that's what they wanted. That way that the case can go on and then they don't get bogged down into appeals on the discovery process for each of the individual cases. So especially for Davis. Davis is looking for injunctive relief. One of the problems might be that there would be a constant back and forth over discovery before even the case gets moving. Now, if discovery is going forward, it's like we can use the Johnson discovery, Circunoff discovery, so it will not slow Davis down. It is further ordered that a status conference and Johnson v. Zuffa, Circunoff v. Zuffa, and Davis v. Zuffa is set for August 28, 2024. And it is further ordered that the party shall submit a joint status report on August 18, 2025. So that is everything that came out of the hearing, kind of boiled down in a summary. And that's where we currently sit in the case of Johnson v. Zuffa, Davis v. Zuffa, and possibly Circunoff v. Zuffa, depending on what they decide to do with that case.
And the next time we have activity in the courts will be August 28th, right?
Well, yeah, live in the courts August 28th, although we will have a filing according to this by June 10th. So we shall see what will come
tomorrow.
out. Yes. Yeah. So we should have, oh man, the time flies. Did not even know what day it was. I'll have to check Pacer tomorrow.
And for those of you listening, that June 10th would be today, but we're recording the night before. All right, so let's get it moving on into the meaty part of the episode here, and that is going to be promotion. So in the last week, we've seen the will they fight, won't they fight conversation between Jon Jones and Tom Aspinall, and it has hit a fever pitch. Now, Dana White said at the post-fight presser that Jon and Tom have actually agreed to fight. Do you think the fight happens? And if it does, would you say that it would be a mega fight because of the buildup around it?
I am not confident the fight will happen. A couple things. One is Ariel Helwani suggested this, I guess. I haven't watched the show, but I saw some, cliff notes from his Monday show. And he had talked about how Jon Jones had been offered a fight for an X amount of money and turned it down. And that kind of, you kind of infer that with Dana White's press conference where he talked about that Jon Jones accepted the fight. We're going to do the fight. But the way he talked about it wasn't like a concrete, like the bout has been signed. In fact, he said later the bout agreement hasn't been signed. It sounded like more that Jon Jones, we offered the amount Jon Jones said he'd want for the fight. And then when we agreed to that and offered it, he did not still accept the fight. That's what it kind of sounds like. So will it happen? I don't know. But it's good to be a mega fight, definitely, because there's a couple things that you need for a mega fight. And one is obviously you need stars involved. Big name fighters have to be involved. That's what makes a mega fight. People that you're aware of, people at the top of their game are so famous, that it's something special. Second is you need debate. Debate goes a long way for a mega fight. Without it, you can't get it. It can be the debate that we had in Mike Tyson versus Jake Paul, where can Mike Tyson beat up Jake Paul? Who will win for some reason, even though Mike Tyson was an old man and everybody should have known the outcome. There was a lot of debate on that. But usually the debate is more when in combat sports, who's really the number one fighter? And that's what, so you have stars, and then you have this, who's truly number one. What made a massive fight out of McGregor versus Khabib is you had stars involved, and also Khabib had taken the championship, was now the number one lightweight while McGregor was gone. And so McGregor was come back. Who is the true champion? When that comes up, that creates debate over that, and which creates interest. And then the final thing is you need some anticipation or marination, as Bob Arum would call it. So delayed gratification. The longer it takes, the more people debate this, the bigger a fight can get. And you go to Manny Pacquiao versus Floyd Mayweather was debated for a long time, just between two stars, which there was a huge debate over who was the better. It just made it into a massive fight. And so we see that time and time again. That's kind of the secret formula for making a big fight. So I would be shocked if this is true, but if the UFC is intentionally telling Jon Jones to not, that we're not going to make this fight, or they're intentionally not making the fight, but having Jon Jones suggest that he doesn't want the fight. So in other words, to create more delayed gratification, to increase debate over who's truly number one, to increase interest between this, to stretch out as long as possible, because they are letting him keep the title. They are not stripping him. I would have to give the UFC a ton of credit, because that would be somewhat genius if that's what they're doing. Now, I don't think they're doing that, but it's possible that they maybe sat down and came up with a plan that we can increase the interest in this fight and drag it on long enough till it becomes a much bigger fight than it currently is. And in that case, I'd have to tip my hat to them, because that would be absolutely genius. But I think it's more likely that there's discussions behind the scene, and maybe Jones just doesn't want to take part in this fight, especially for the amount of money being offered. I do not know what the amount of money is. Juani says they met the amount Jones wanted, but maybe Jones set a new amount. I don't know. But that, I would have to guess that's it. But it is, I don't think it's impossible to think that perhaps this is slightly being orchestrated to make a bigger fight.
When you say that, it would be genius for them to do that, and then you said, but I don't think they're intentionally doing that. Why do you say that you don't think that's what they're doing?
Well, I don't think intentionally, because it's very hard to pull that off in many ways, because someone might let it slip. You don't know if someone's going to get injured. It's just there's moving parts. And also you are giving more leverage to the fighters, because the more valuable the fight becomes, the more leverage they have to ask for more. Otherwise they derail the fight. Right. And UFC does not like to do that. It's just not, it's not something they normally do. They don't build up fights this way. Normally they come, they come hand delivered to them often, or by accident. McGregor goes off, takes off, and fights Mayweather. He's gone for a while, and Khabib comes along, wins the title. That was not something they planned ahead of time to make that fight bigger. So it's just not a normal way that they operate. And they haven't cared about it in the past when they had massive fights on the books that they could have made. So it's just not something they commonly do. But at the same time, it would be very smart promotional tactics if they did that. It would be a very smart strategy to build up more interest in this fight, because as fight promoters will tell you, if you ask them, sometimes 1 + 1 does not equal 2 on a fight. Sometimes you can make 1 + 1 equal 4 or 8. And this is the type of fight that's starting to grow and grow, just in massive amounts every time the buildup continues along. The anticipation is there. The more we discuss it, the more debate there is about it. The more Bob Arum marination that takes place, the bigger this fight potentially gets.
Jon Jones brought up fighting Francis Ngannou as something he'd be very interested in. Is this a possibility or not?
Well, you'd think it would be. This is one of the reasons I don't think the UFC is intentionally doing that, because this fight is already reached the cake has been baked for Ngannou Jones. This is a fight Ngannou is a more well-known fighter than Jones. You can look at Google Trends. You can look at a bunch of different sources. People are more aware of him. He has a bigger name around the world because he went off to box and fought, Fury and Joshua, and because he left the UFC title. There's a bigger question because he is the linear champion. He is the true former UFC champion, never lost it in the cage. Jones is the one that got it almost as an email champ, although he did have to beat Cyril Gane to get it. But, he has the tarnished and really the interim belt, even though they award him the full belt. So this fight has been built up to what we were talking about Aspinall already, and yet the UFC never pulled the trigger on it. And you would think they'd be interested in it still. But Dana White in a press conference post-fight did say that, he shot it down by one, saying that they don't have Ngannou under contract. But they often say that about fights. They can always get a guy under contract if they want to make it. But he also hinted too that they're not interested in working with Ngannou. I don't know if that's true. I mean, he does say that all the time, that he doesn't want to work with Ngannou, but I don't know how true that is, because he said that throughout the history of the UFC, there's a long track record of him talking about fighters he will not work with, Who can forget Tito Ortiz when they let Tito Ortiz go the first time? Who can forget when they put that warning out to anybody that signed to the EA Sports game back in 2009 and 10 that you will never get in the UFC? That didn't last long. Kimbo Slice we would never let him into the UFC. That didn't last. There's just a long list of fighters. We'll never have women's fight in the UFC. I will never work with Vadim Finkelstein, and now we find out the guy has equity in the UFC. So there's a long list of promises that get broken, and you'd think if the opportunity came to do a fight with Francis that worked within the UFC business model, that they would 100% do it because that fight would be massive. It would be massive against Jones, and it would be big against Aspinall. So you think that'd be something they would be thinking about. But right now, there's no indication we get that actually it is something the UFC would do.
Don Davis issued a challenge to once again co-promote a fight between Francis and Jon with the UFC. What did you think of that?
I mean, not much. It was purely a PR move, what he said. Winner takes all. We're going to put our guy against your guy. The winner gets 100% of the profits. Well, how are you defining profits? First question. Why? On what planet would the UFC agree to this where the production costs, everything put up, and then one side only gets all the profits? None of this makes sense. It was not a serious offer. And it just even a PR, it's a cringe PR attempt by Davis. If he really, really wanted to make, to throw out an offer that made some sense, he could say, we'll co-promote, but we know the UFC won't do that. So why not offer, if he really wants to see the fight make, why not offer to lease Ngannou to the UFC? That happens in boxing all the time. They lease fighters to other promotions. That promotion becomes the main promoter. In this case, Ngannou could have your name attached to him as he's being promoted by you. Maybe he gets to wear the PFL, fighter kit to the ring, something like that. But the UFC then would just be responsible for paying Ngannou's purse, which would be a good advertisement for PFL too, because it would be much more than the UFC fighters. Based on what we know and how the pay-per-view points work for Ngannou, he would get much more than the other fighters. So you could lease him to the UFC, get a percentage or some payment on top of that, and make some money instead of losing money on fights, and potentially get advertised with the PFL. That would be one offer. The other is say, listen, well, why don't we, put this up for purse bid? Whoever can put up the most money for the two fighters can put it up. And if you do not want to get in a purse bid with us, I tell you what, why don't we say, Ngannou, Jones, you want to fight? Us and the UFC will sit this out. And if you guys can find someone up to put a purse bid, we'll let you freely go and do that. And just have to include the PFL name. Now, I mean, from the PFL, that even if that ever happened, that'd be a big win for them because you would have PFL branding everywhere, at least attached to Ngannou, because you're never going to put on that fight otherwise. So, and it's never going to happen, but at least it sounds like you're willing to take a sacrifice to get this fight made, instead of trying to find a way where you will only benefit at the UFC's expense.
We discussed a way that PFL could fight back with a lawsuit of their own against the UFC. I mean, we have discussed this on several different episodes going back probably a year or more. Remind everyone of exactly what was said, and do you ever think that they would actually file suit against the UFC?
Well, to go back over that, we talked about what are the other options, and we've talked about numerous times. Specifically, I think at the end of the last, the settlement phase of the Lee v. Zuffa, when people were disappointed in the outcome, what are other options fighters could do? One, we talked about people could, someone could sue the UFC for a restraint on trade. Now, that's what Davis is doing, the restraint on trade. A little different than what I envisioned it as, but I got to give him credit. They're doing a restraint on trade complaint. That's one we argued. The other is that a promoter could do kind of a restraint on trade complaint. It could be a class action with multiple promoters or just on his own, and basically argue what Davis is arguing is that the UFC has, because of their power, have dominated the market, have signed up all the top fighters. They're not available. I cannot put on big fights. I want to sue them to give me the right to at least be able to, put a bid in or something to have access to some top fighters that I can promote big fights, that I can survive in this in this industry. And if you read, and I recommend, again, if you get a chance, read the Davis complaint. They bring this up. You would be very easy to change that into a complaint for a promoter. But that is something PFL or any other promoter could think about filing against UFC, but they won't. And we talked about this before. They won't, for the simple reason is because they won't get investment money if they do that. Because what that is telling everybody is, one is, I cannot compete with the UFC. They do have market power. There's no way to compete with them. So why would an investor want to give you $100 million? They know, I know you can't compete. You filed a complaint talking about how you can't compete. Two is that you're basically also making the pitch that I want to compete with the UFC for fighters. Well, if that's the case, that's going to drive up the cost of fighters and profit margins will go down. The pitch, these guys, PFL, won championship, all these guys that are trying to raise private equity or investment capital to challenge the UFC to make the duopoly, is their pitch is, we are going to have a Pepsi to the UFC's Coca-Cola. We are going to make a promotion similar to the UFC, but separate. It's going to be a walled garden like the UFC. We'll operate on a very similar business model. We'll have our own titles. We will control the rankings, everything in the business, and we can pay the fighters a very small share of the revenue, just like the UFC. And I'll note, one of the things Don Davis a couple of years ago would talk to in interviews were basically pitches to investors, was one of the great things about MMA was the cost of the athletes was low, right? So that was something he was letting them know, that the athlete costs are low, which means that if you succeed in the business, your profits can be high. And so you would not, if that is your goal, if your objective is to make a Pepsi Cola to the UFC's Coca-Cola, then what you don't really want is competition, open competition between the two promotions, because that, again, will drive up wages and it'll become, more like boxing. And what you don't want is boxing, where the profit margins, the margins for promoters are 10% if they're lucky. That's a lot. You want 30, 40% margins. UFC's at 50, 60% margins right now. You want at least 20 to 30%. You want these huge margins to pay back your investors to make the return on investment worthwhile, because otherwise they wouldn't have gave you hundreds of millions of dollars. You need some sort of your own monopsony power over your own fighters. You need them trapped into contracts they can't get out. You need them that you get to dictate who fights, who win, who gets to ascend, who gets to fight for the title. You need to be able to control them and maintain them in your promotion, lock them in so they don't leave at their most valuable. You need to do basically everything the UFC does. And so the lawsuit like that would not help them. It would help them survive, help them compete, but would not help them with the people that just gave them hundreds of millions of dollars. And so that's why I doubt any of those promotions will ever file a suit like that.
Francis Ngannou's coach, Eric Nixick, he says that Francis is very open to returning to the UFC. Do you think that Francis is extricated from his contract with PFL? Well,
before I get to the contract, I should note, I talked to some people, and apparently Nixick did not quite quote Francis right. I should actually paraphrase this or preference this by noting that I don't even know if this is 100% accurate, because I didn't talk to Francis, but I had heard that Francis really was, it wasn't that he was interested in going back to the UFC. He was interested in fighting Jon Jones. That's what I heard. Now, the other thing I heard is that Francis is still under contract with PFL. That's what everybody seems to be claiming. And I can't say that that's completely false, but I do know, based on my sources, based on what I know, that my understanding is, I'm pretty positive of this, that when Francis first signed his contract, there was an end date on that contract with PFL. It was a 2-year maximum contract, and the promotional agreement would end on March 31st, 2025. So the promotional agreement, based on that original contract he signed, should have ended March 31st, 2025. Now, it's also a 2-month exclusive negotiating period, which would have just ended, meaning that Francis Ngannou, except for whatever matching rights are on there, would now be a free agent. And I think that is very possible, but it is also possible because the contract had the option to extend it on, if both parties agree, that possibly they add an extension for whatever reason, maybe Ngannou, because of his personal problems and injury, whatever, that he asked for an extension, that he couldn't take a fight and asked to extend it for a little bit. I don't know. It could have been extended. Maybe they've just recently signed a new contract and haven't announced it. I kind of doubt that, because if you signed Francis to a new contract, you would think you would announce that to the world. Plus, the word I get is that he has one fight left, which would be the one fight on his 2-fight deal. So the other possibility is right now is, I guess there's two. One is when Francis Ngannou was fighting in the UFC, he knew that the Gane fight was the last fight on his contract, but he also knew he had a sunset clause and could have just waited a year and get out of that contract. But he decided, for his own personal reasons, he says this in interviews, that I was going to fight that last fight to show that I honored the agreement and completed the contract. And that way I could leave knowing that I'd honored my agreement. So it's possible maybe he views it the same way with PFL. I signed a 2-fight agreement. I am going to finish this 2-fight agreement. The other possibility is because maybe he wants to work with them on PFL Africa. He does not see a chance going back to the UFC. He still wants to work with them on that. That's another possibility. I guess the third possibility is a free agent. No one wants to admit it. So that's the third possibility. So I think on his contract, I think that's the situation we're in right now. Best of my knowledge, his original agreement should be completed or ended unless Francis Ngannou has decided that he does not want to end, or that he's willing to has extended it further. So I think that's where we sit with the Francis Ngannou contract.
Now, when you say that that they were misquoting Francis or what have you, saying that he said he was open to fighting Jon Jones, do you think that would be in like neutral territory? Is that what he's saying?
Well, I'm not sure what he's saying on that front. I was just saying that when Eric Nixon said Francis is very open to returning to the UFC, my understanding was that he was really saying that Eric Nixon was misquoting him, saying he was willing to fight Jon Jones. Now, maybe he's willing to, go to the UFC. France had that comment about Jones. You work the UFC and I work the PFL. I can't remember how he phrased it, but basically I finish off the PFL, you finish off the UFC, and then we'll determine it. A lot of people took it like, oh, they both have to finish their contracts. I kind of read it like, John, you get the UFC degree, I'll get PFL degree, and then we'll have a meeting, which seems incredibly unrealistic. As I said before, the most realistic possibility, which is still probably unlikely because I don't think the UFC would do this, is PFL offering to lease Francis to the UFC. Let the UFC cover his costs, let him come into the cage with a PFL outfitter kit and have maybe a PFL logo in his corner. That could be and the PFL could ask for, Francis's purse plus a little bit more. So the UFC would have to cover him, $10 million guaranteed up front. And I think it's $10 per pay-per-view buy over 300,000-400,000. And so, and a little bit more if it breaks certain on the gate. So in the end result, if it sells as much as the UFC and everybody seems to think it will, that would be the biggest fight in heavyweight history, one of the biggest fights in UFC history, let's say almost 2 million buys. Then Francis would make, over $20 million, even after he pays off the PFL their share. I guess the question, would Jon Jones make that much? So I think, PFL, that would be a smart thing for them to do, to offer to do that to the UFC. I think that is the most realistic possibility of it ever happening. But I don't see the UFC agreeing to that for various reasons, because they just don't like working with other parties on big fights. The risk of, unless Jon Jones or Francis signed to a long-term agreement, there just adds a bunch of risk. But who knows?
I saw a comment from Jonathan Snowden that said that the UFC's decline started with the ESPN deal. Now, I think that he's referring to the decline in quality. I'm pretty sure that's where he was going with that. I just want to know if you would agree with him. To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow!
the face! Ooh, ooh, okay, the face!